Breaking news, ladies. The brand new Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program is finally here. If you are a women's health professional with an existing practice and you've struggled to incorporate fertility awareness charting into your client work, this is the program you've been waiting for. There's nothing like it offered anywhere. Transform your practice in 6 months. We start the first week of March. Apply now at fertilityfriday.com/FAM, FAMM live. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMM LIVE. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 352. Welcome to the Fertility Friday podcast, your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm your host, Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. I'm the author of The Fifth Vital Sign and the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Journal. I'm a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner with nearly 20 years of experience teaching women to connect to their fifth vital sign through menstrual cycle charting, balancing hormonal health, and optimizing the menstrual cycle without hormones. I'm outspoken about hormonal birth control and its impact on fertility and overall health because you have the right to know how your body works and how artificial hormones disrupt that natural process. I host live coaching programs to help you achieve optimal fertility and health because it's important to have healthy menstrual cycles regardless of whether or not you want to have babies. I'm also a wife and mother of 2 beautiful boys. I know, I'm a busy girl, but I managed to fit it all in. This podcast is designed to empower you to take full control of your cycles, your fertility, and your overall health. And I'm so excited that you're here with us today. Today's episode was actually inspired by a couple of back-to-back conversations that I've had with clients over the past little while. And this is a topic that I've touched on before, but today I decided to just jump in full force. So today we are going to be talking about decoding the male influencer space. So I'm sure that obviously I won't be talking about every possible thing under this heading, but there are a few specific things that I really want to talk about today because they do relate to the menstrual cycle and they relate to current trends that are happening. And really and truly, there are just some things that I feel need to be said. So with that said, let's jump in and talk today about decoding the male influencer space. All right. So as I mentioned, today's topic was really inspired by a few conversations that I've had with clients recently, but generally speaking, conversations that have come up in my client work pretty consistently over the past several years. And ultimately, the topic of decoding the male influencer space, really and truly, it's really about highlighting some current trends that are happening and how they affect our menstrual cycle, how they affect us. And essentially, a good place to start is basically by just, putting it out there that men and women are very different in terms of our hormonal profiles and how we respond to different activities. So it'll come as no surprise that today we'll be talking about intermittent fasting, about certain dietary practices, magical supplements, and how we can actually use the menstrual cycle as the great equalizer. So I'll be taking this topic in such a way that I won't necessarily be calling out individuals or even specific diets or practices. But I think that anyone who is paying attention to what's happening, the different trends that are happening on social media, you'll be more than familiar with many of them. So intermittent fasting is a good place to start because certainly this is a trend that we've seen more of. In my client work over the years, I've certainly seen an increase in the number of women who are doing some sort of intermittent fasting. Basically, intermittent fasting involves changing the window in which you eat. And it can be done in a number of ways. It can involve eating 1 meal a day, 2 meals a day, 3 meals a day. And of course, fasting in general can involve going spans of time without eating. So fasting in and of itself isn't necessarily a new thing, but certainly there's been a lot more attention to the concept of intermittent fasting and restricting the eating window for a number of different reasons. And if you have certain health goals, for example, if you're trying to lose weight, or if you are trying to balance your blood sugar, or, whatever challenge that you're facing, when you tune in to many of these male influencers, it can really feel like this is the ticket to every type of health benefit imaginable. And the reason that I'm calling it out in this particular way is because there is a difference between men and women. And so plenty of men can do fasting in certain ways and see incredible benefits and talk about those benefits. And certainly it's real. It happens. So there are many men who can fast, meaning go length spans of time without eating food. So go days without eating food for periods of time, or skip meals. So for instance, having one meal a day, or literally just skipping breakfast and having 2 meals a day. And certainly if you are kind of nodding your head, there are plenty of men. If you listen to podcasts, if you follow different people in the fitness and health space that are male, then certainly you may have heard these types of suggestions before. And again, these types of practices can work extremely well for men. So you don't have to search hard or long to find success stories of men who have either skipped meals, restricted their eating pretty significantly, maybe have one day a week where they don't eat at all, or something, things of that nature. And, the weight drops off, reach their fitness goals and have wonderful experiences with it. And so again, as women, when we are following the male influencer space and we're hearing these incredible success stories, it makes perfect sense that we would be more likely to give it a try and kind of do it the way that they do it. This is why I love menstrual cycle charting, because ultimately we're not small men. Women and men are different. We have different bodies. We have different physiological processes happening. And certainly we have different hormonal profiles. And that means that we have different requirements for, depending on, again, what your goals are. So if you are a woman of reproductive age, meaning that you should be cycling, part of being a woman of reproductive age, optimally from that health perspective, the whole fifth vital sign thing, right, is that we should have cycles that are falling into normal parameters. So it does mean, in order to have a cycle that is falling into normal parameters, you do have to ovulate. You do have to have your period. And ultimately, if you kind of break down the cycle into the different parts, you would expect, at the beginning of your cycle to have your period. It lasts anywhere from about 3 to 7 days with an average of about 5 days or so. Once your period is done, you would expect to have a few days before you start to see cervical fluid. We call those dry days. Once you start to see cervical fluid, we would expect to see anywhere between, 2 to 7 days of cervical fluid, and we would expect it to lead up to your ovulation. And, cervical fluid can be the creamy white, lotiony kind of stuff, and it can be the clear raw egg whites. We would expect at least 1 day where you see the clear raw egg white type, at least throughout that day. And then we would expect it to end with ovulation. So in a healthy cycle, we expect ovulation to happen. Now, the length of the cycle can range anywhere from about 24 to 35 days. And so within that parameter, ovulation, we would expect to happen somewhere between days 10 and days 23. And then in a healthy cycle, once you ovulate, you would expect then the second half of your cycle, so the post-ovulatory or luteal phase, to last about 12 to 14 days. And a healthy cycle, when we talk about bleeding, we would expect the bleeding to happen during your period. So it's not uncommon to have some spotting before you start your period, but it's not optimal. And certainly it typically is a sign that there's an issue with progesterone production, because in a healthy cycle, your progesterone actually prevents bleeding until your period starts. And the reason that I'm going through this is because when you have that sense of, okay, this is what a healthy cycle looks like, then if you start to change your eating practices and you see those cycle patterns shift, then certainly that is a huge sign. That is the vital sign component of this. And of course, it is different if you are not cycling. So if you're a woman of reproductive age, but you're using a hormonal method of birth control, hormonal methods are suppressing the natural cycle. The vast majority of hormonal methods prevent ovulation or suppress it to some degree. And so you wouldn't necessarily be seeing a pattern, a proper cycle, so to speak. And so it can also happen that you have already adopted this method of eating, the intermittent fasting, and then you come off of hormonal birth control, and perhaps it takes a while for your cycles to return, or when they return, maybe they are or outside of the normal parameter. So just as an example. But back to intermittent fasting. So again, depending on what your goals are. So if you're a woman of reproductive age and your goal is to balance your hormones and have healthy cycles, or if you are planning to have a baby at some point in the near future, then again, the cycle becomes very, very important as a way to gauge your bio-individuality. So there's one level of that bio-individuality in that if you are a woman of reproductive age, like the first thing is like you're not a man. So men are different. They have different physiology. So whereas men can experience really great results from certain practices, like I said, skipping meals, having one meal a day, not eating on Sundays or whatever, or even going weeks without eating, so fasting. And there's a lot of men that just have incredible success. Honestly, I mean, it's incredible. But see, the thing is that in my practice, the menstrual cycle is kind of front and center. And what I tend to see is that when women are trying to essentially jump in and do different types of intermittent fasting, it typically leads to menstrual cycle disruptions. And there's a couple of reasons for that. And so it doesn't mean that you can't intermittent fast, depending on the situation, but it does mean that you may have to do it in a different way than, say, for instance, like the male influencer that you're following. So I think one of the reminders that I often share with my clients is that intermittent fasting can actually involve eating 3 meals a day. And so what I find is a lot of women will kind of do the thing where they skip breakfast. Sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's not intentional. But if it's part of an intermittent fasting routine where you're eating over, say, an 8-hour period, you're going to choose an 8-hour period, and throughout that period is the only time you're going to eat during the day, then what can happen is if you're only eating 2 meals, what are the chances that if you were to, those 2 meals are actually going to account for the total caloric equivalent of 3 meals? So I guess what I'm saying is I think oftentimes we think, again, and fully calling it out today, but when you're listening to male influencers who say things like, just skip breakfast, you kind of get the sense that you can just skip breakfast and then eat lunch and dinner and that for that to be sufficient. And see, one of the challenges is if you are wanting to restrict the period of time that you eat. So if you're wanting to consume all of your meals within, like, say, an 8-hour period or something like that, the trick is to actually consume the equivalent of 3 full meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, during that 8-hour span. And so as soon as we start skipping meals as women, of reproductive age with menstrual cycles, then what tends to happen is we eat less food overall during that 24-hour period. When you're eating less food than is required over a 24-hour period, and this is a pattern that continues, meaning that you're not consuming enough calories really to account for it. And one thing I will say is that many of the women who I've worked with over the years who fall into these patterns, they're not necessarily feeling hungry. So for them, there's a lot of things that we can do to suppress that hunger, and we may not realize that it's happening. So the easiest example of that is drinking coffee in the morning. So if you are intermittent fasting and your breakfast is coffee is an appetite suppressant. And so if you drink coffee every morning, for example, or black tea, something caffeinated, then you may not even realize that the reason that you're not hungry is because the coffee suppressed your appetite. And this is a real thing. It is known. You can look it up in the research for all you research heads that are listening. And so if you have that pattern, sometimes we want to blame the coffee. I mean, coffee has its own challenges and in terms of how it can affect hormones. But ultimately, what I typically see is that women who get into these patterns of trying to fit their meals into a certain period of time, and again, following kind of that male influencer space, like, oh, just skip breakfast, and then kind of eating 2 meals a day, what I typically see is that it can be a pattern like that where you're having coffee, that's the breakfast, and then you end up having 2 meals for the rest of the day. And what happens ultimately is that if you eat 2 meals a day, not 3, you're typically, and especially if you're intermittent fasting, meaning that you're not snacking at all in between, then you're typically going to be getting less food overall, because no one's eating like dinner and a half. It's kind of hard to eat. You really need to stop eating when you're full. So we're really not going to get the same amount of food as if we were to eat 3 meals. So it's just kind of a reminder. Typically what I see and the conversations that I have when I'm working with women who are wanting to embrace intermittent fasting is that what works best for women of reproductive age, if they want their hormones and their cycles balanced, is to eat 3 meals a day. So 3 full, solid meals a day. Meals that contain protein, fat, and carbohydrates in sufficient quantities 3 times. And if you want to intermittent fast, then you can eat a full meal and then, not eat until the next meal, and then eat a full meal and then not eat until the 3rd meal. So certainly this is a big topic because many women are doing this because they're wanting to achieve their goals, whatever those goals may be. And often those goals are weight related, right? We want to achieve certain health and fitness goals. And so women who are jumping into intermittent fasting are often, and I would say much more likely to be extremely health conscious and are often also really fit, not all the time, but often also have an exercise routine alongside it. And again, if just go with me for a minute. So if you are restricting the time that you're eating and skipping breakfast, I'm picking on breakfast, it could be lunch, right? But I'm just giving this as an example. And then you are consuming 2 main meals a day, right? We've gone from 3 meals to 2 and we're eating in a small window. And then you add on top of it, a pretty healthy exercise regimen. Then what we have is fewer calories overall throughout the 24 period of the day, more movement, more activity. And again, this obviously can lead to menstrual cycle issues. So bringing it back to the menstrual cycle, the menstrual cycle is a wonderful tool when we pay attention to it. And so the cycle is a vital sign, and there's different ways to look at it. There's just looking at a cycle kind of by itself and looking at the parameters of that cycle. And then there's also the usefulness of looking at the cycle over periods of time. And so for anyone who has charted their cycle, let's say for 6 months or more, for example, then you've already had the opportunity to see for yourself that the cycle isn't always the same, that ovulation does fluctuate. Your periods can be different. Maybe one cycle, your period's a day longer or shorter, or a little heavier or lighter. And as you get into it, you start to see that you are affecting that. And if you make certain changes, you might find that the ovulation in the cycle is a bit later or a little bit earlier. Or if you make certain changes in the cycle, the second half of the cycle is a little bit shorter or longer. It's really, really helpful from my perspective as a practitioner then to establish a baseline with my client. So if I'm working with someone who has a charting history, then that's helpful because we can see the change. And we can see what happened when we started the fasting. We can see what happened when we started the exercise. And ultimately, if there's nothing wrong with what you're doing, then your cycle parameters would be completely normal. And so when we start to see, so some of the things to look for. So now if you're wondering, okay, so I've been doing this and I've been having some concerns with my cycle and I'm wondering if they're related. So some of the signs that the intermittent fasting may not be the most amazing thing for your body right now would certainly be the parameters. So I did go over the parameters, so certainly you can kind of reverse back and listen to those again. But ultimately, if you start to see signs of your luteal phase getting shorter, or if your luteal phase is, say, like 11 days or less, right? So if 11 days is like teetering, we want it to be a minimum, I would say, of 11 days, but 11 days is a shorter luteal phase. Like 12 is a good number. Just kind of remember that. So if your luteal phase is kind of teetering, if you do see spotting and start tracking it. So let's say, for example, you track over 6 months and you start to see that there's some times where you spot for 3 days and then other times where you spot for 1 day, or you see that the luteal phase is sometimes like a day shorter or longer. Those are things you want to pay attention to. And ultimately, your cycle really acts as a gauge. And it tells us that we actually have limits. It tells us that we aren't men and that we respond to things differently. And it helps us tailor what we're doing to our own bio-individuality, what is good for our own body. And it's certainly possible that, you may have a friend that can get away with way more than you can. But then what I always say is but you don't really know what's happening in your friend's cycle. So you may think that your friend is getting away with it, and you may not really know what's really happening there. So just to recap, there's this trend of intermittent fasting. Men can get incredible results from doing things like skipping meals, not eating, 1 day a week or whatever the case is. And it's really easy to find those testimonials. If you're curious and this is a new topic for you, literally just do an internet search on intermittent fasting, weight loss. I mean, maybe that's a bad idea, but it's really easy to find a lot of men who've really benefited from this and who get lean real fast and then add their fitness to it and get real cut. And so it can seem like, wow, it worked so great for him. This is going to work really well for me. And again, it is a thing. It's not good to have an abnormal menstrual cycle. And certainly if your cycle is not falling into normal parameters, this is one of the first places that we should really be looking. So it's really up to you if charting your cycle is something that you're wanting to do, right? You're listening to this podcast, you're probably interested in charting at least, even just from an interest perspective. And so the cycle, I always say, is a great equalizer. So if you can eat 2 meals a day and drink coffee, right? Skip breakfast type of thing, and suppress that every day, and you eat 2 meals a day. And if you can do that and your cycle completely falls into normal parameters, you have great energy, everything's great, then great. What can I say? But if you notice that your cycle is not falling into those normal parameters and you are starting to see signs of it, then that is a sign. Okay, so let's move on then from intermittent fasting. Along those same lines, there are a number of, I'm picking on the men today, so I'm just calling it as I see it. But there's certainly also a lot of male influencers and also other health conscious individuals who promote certain specific types of diets. So I'm not even necessarily picking on any particular diet, but there's certainly a lot of, quote, diets that are being really promoted, right? So, there's plant-based diets like vegan diets, meaning like no animal protein at all. There are even diets that promote eating only fruit, right? There are paleo diets, low-carb diets. There's all kinds of diets, Mediterranean diets. And so one of the things I think is important to watch out for is that when you're following certain male influencers that promote certain types of diet, carnivore just came to mind too. And again, I'm not picking on any particular diet. The point of this actually isn't to pick on a particular type of diet. It's to pick on the idea that there's one type of diet for everyone at every time of their life. And this diet is going to prevent illness. It's going to give you weight loss. It's like a magical miracle situation. And what's interesting is if you get interested in a certain type of diet, and whether that's, for instance, all meat or whether it's all plants, I'll just kind of so I'm an equal opportunity offender here. But just as an example, right? It's very easy to, especially now. So when I was first getting into fertility awareness, the internet wasn't like it was, and, there was no social media. And so it was just a different time. Whereas today, we can really immerse ourselves in whatever it is that we're interested in. And all of the information that we get into our inboxes, the information that we watch, whatever we're scrolling in our feeds, we cultivate that. And without realizing it, we can create a very narrow, kind of one-sided view of the world. And so if you kind of get into a certain type of diet, it can really feel like that is all there is, and this is the right way, and everyone should eat like this and forever. And again, there's a lot of, in the male health influencer space, there are certain corners of that space where these ideas are very heavily pushed. And so the idea that there's one way that everyone should eat, this is what people should eat, throughout their lives. And sometimes we're not considering that so if you think about it kind of as different phases throughout your life, for example, a baby has different requirements than a growing child, who has different requirements than a teenager who's going through puberty, who has different requirements to someone who is actively trying to have a baby, who would have different requirements to a woman who is heavily pregnant, who would then have different requirements to a woman who's breastfeeding, who would then have different requirements to a woman who is heading into menopause and has then passed that phase. So what I'm encouraging you to think about is that I don't believe that there's one diet that is good for everyone, first of all, because everyone isn't the same. And I also don't necessarily believe that there is a diet that would work for everyone throughout their entire lives. And so what I find is that there are a lot of women who are of reproductive age. So women, reproductive age, menstruating. We're trying to balance our hormones, right? We're trying to maintain a good body size. We want to feel good about ourselves and all of that. But when we are actually trying to optimize our cycles, our hormones, our fertility, if we're thinking of having children within a few years, or if you're actively trying right now, the diet that you might need can be very different than the diet of someone who, for instance, there's a lot of men in the health influencer space that may be in their 50s and 60s, and they're promoting a certain way of eating. And, when there's different phases of life, so if a person is past that childbearing age, they may have certain concerns that they're wanting to mitigate for where they are in their lives. So cancer, for example, they may be wanting to eat a certain way to mitigate their risk of cancer at a certain age because that's their primary concern. They may actually be past the stage where they're trying to have children. They may have grown children or grandchildren. And so their primary concern isn't trying to build their sperm. If you're following the male health influencer space, that person's primary concern may be avoiding certain types of illnesses, lowering some of the illnesses that affect us with age. So it's not to say that those things aren't important at all ages to mitigate. But what I'm saying is, again, it comes down to your goals. And so the reason that I'm bringing, the title of today's episode, Decoding the Male Influencer Space, is really just to have that kind of reminder that what you may need as a woman of reproductive age who's trying to optimize your hormone profile, who's trying to balance your cycle, have healthy periods, healthy ovulation, healthy luteal phase, prepare your body for pregnancy, support both you and your partner's optimal fertility. It can be different to the male influencer in the health space that you're following. And it may not have occurred to you that individual may have different goals than you. And the diet that they're promoting may actually not necessarily be the one that's right for the phase of your life that you're in. And it doesn't mean that the diet is good or bad. Maybe it just means that there would be a phase of your life where it would be a bit more appropriate than when you're trying to actively have babies. And I mean, that also ties into the intermittent fasting angle as well, because it's not necessarily every phase of your life that it might be advantageous to restrict your eating. So that's something I think is really important just to consider when it comes to what your goals are, what you're trying to achieve. And again, it comes back to the menstrual cycle, because when you're trying to achieve a healthy menstrual cycle, balance hormones, and you're charting, you can see in your chart if what you're doing is working. And if you have tried everything, you've tried all the supplements, you've tried, all these different things, and your cycle still isn't in the healthy, normal range, and you're still having concerns, there does come a time where it only makes sense to ask that question. if your diet could be a factor. And you'll notice on the podcast that, I don't promote, I've never promoted a specific type of diet. I've never said a name of a insert diet X and follow that. What I'm typically concerned about is that you're getting sufficient protein, fat, and carbohydrates. All my clients are laughing because they've heard me say it so many times. So getting sufficient food into your body, balancing your protein, fat, and carbohydrates so that you can maintain a good blood sugar balance. And then, of course, whether you are restoring nutrients postpartum or restoring nutrients post-birth control pill, or whether you're trying to build up your nutrient stores during your preconception phase or, postpartum before more babies. These are specific requirements where we would be looking to add in specific foods that are high in the key nutrients that we need, to build our bodies and to store. But in terms of me recommending a specific way of eating, it's not something that I do. And so another important point, just to kind of bring the magical diet, one diet for everyone, to a close, is that, again, everyone isn't the same. So anyone who says that everyone should eat a certain way, I would just question that. First of all, everyone isn't the same. So everyone isn't going to eat the same way, period. And then the other thing is that everyone isn't the same throughout their whole lives. Like, you're only a baby once. So you have different requirements when you're a baby. My two sons are age 5 and 8. They would have different requirements. They're growing. They've tripled, quadrupled in size since they were babies. That's a very different period of time than me being a grown adult who's not growing anymore and all those types of things. So everyone isn't the same. So everyone isn't going to eat the same way. That doesn't make sense. Everyone's body doesn't respond the same way to everything. And then also everyone isn't in the same phase of life. And again, when you are trying to achieve optimal health, fertility, hormonal balance, if you're trying to have babies, then you may not actually want to follow the male influencer who's in their 50s or 60s, because that individual may have different goals than you. And so what they're recommending may actually be a little bit incongruent for what your goals are as a woman of reproductive age who's trying to have babies or maintain optimal hormone balance. Okay, so there's one other thing I wanted to bring up as well, which is the magical supplement. So I'm not necessarily going to go into what that gives specific examples, but there are a lot of great and questionable individuals online who talk a lot about magical supplements, magical foods, and it's really easy to get caught up in the excitement. So it's kind of like, you need to take this thing and everyone should take this thing and everyone needs to take this much of this thing. And this one magical fruit is going to do this and that and all this. So you get what I'm saying without actually throwing any particular individual under the bus. But if you've ever found yourself following someone who's literally saying, everyone needs to take this thing and everyone needs to take this much of this thing and everyone needs this supplement and everyone needs this magical thing, everyone doesn't need anything. And I think that's something to again, it's something that should give you pause. Everyone is different. And even something, so to give the example of vitamin D, like that's something we all need, sure. But no one can really stand up in front of the world and say everyone needs exactly this much vitamin D. We can have guidelines and all of those types of things, but when it comes down to it, even vitamin D, which is something that everyone needs, if you have health challenges, if you have fertility challenges, you're still going to want to consider testing that so that you can identify what your actual levels are. If you find out that you're deficient, it's a good idea to, again, test, work with your practitioner to come up with a strategy and a dosage that would make sense, and then retest to see how it's going, because some people can take a certain amount of vitamin D and it restores their levels in a relatively normal period of time. And other people can take the same amount of vitamin D and their levels don't really budge. So that's just one example. But the point, again, is bio-individuality. Jumping into today's episode to share some exciting news. The Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program is officially here. If you've been searching for a practical way to incorporate fertility awareness cycle charting into your existing women's health practice, this is the program for you. Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship is a 6-month training program that provides the necessary training to incorporate fertility awareness cycle charting into your existing practice. This program cuts out all of the fluff by combining the science with the practical application of charting and allows you to support your clients by monitoring their fifth vital sign in a standardized way. Transform your practice in 6 months. Apply now at fertilityfriday.com/FAMLive. That's FAMMLIVE. So again, fertilityfriday.com/FAMMLive. I hope that this episode, it's not done yet. I have a couple more points, but I hope that you're kind of like picking up what I'm putting down, which is essentially that it's kind of like a reminder to everyone who's listening that, you are unique. I mean, you're not so unique that it's not like we're so unique that we don't require like the basic building blocks of life. And like, we all need protein, we all need fat, we all need carbohydrates, but but we are all different is my point. And again, there's a lot of really interesting things happening, a lot of really interesting trends, and it can get really exciting because many of us are struggling with a variety of different health challenges. And, when someone talks about this magical thing that helped them to feel so much better, it can be really tempting to really jump on that bandwagon. And so it doesn't mean that that magical supplement that person is talking about couldn't do something for you. But when you're hearing someone talk about this magical thing and how everyone needs to take it and everyone should do it and all of that kind of stuff, I feel like it's worthwhile to pause because there's few things that everyone needs to do. And it's very easy to get caught up in that and find yourself taking a bunch of stuff that someone recommended, and it could actually not even necessarily be needed. So this is just kind of one of those things. So it's just kind of you think of it as like a public service announcement, but to kind of bring it all back to the menstrual cycle, this is one of the reasons, again, why I always fall back to that, because it's a reminder of what really works for us. And I did want to take a moment to talk a little bit about, for the practitioners who are listening, how it can apply when you're working with clients. And so, from a practitioner perspective, if you're able to understand the menstrual cycle and utilize it as a vital sign when you're working with clients, then it can help you in I would say 2 major ways. I mean, I'm sure there's more ways than that, but one of the ways that it can help is that it can really help you to understand your client and what's happening with them. So in the same way that I was sharing how you can use your cycle to monitor, for example, if you change your eating patterns or if you change your exercise patterns and you see certain shifts in your cycle that, either positive or negative, but if you see, for example, your negative shifts in your cycle that would indicate that, you're kind of stressing your body out, that can be a really, really great tool, because what it can do is your cycle is unique to you and it's responding directly to what you're doing. So as a practitioner, if you're able to utilize that sign, then it gives you this very kind of real-time physical evidence that maybe what your client is doing could be, less than beneficial. And so having it from that perspective can be really helpful because it can allow you to really see what is working for that person and what is not working for that person. And it's not so magical that you can necessarily always kind of look at it from like, okay, your client comes in with their chart today and you can just make all these magical assessments. But one of the ways that the chart is really useful is over time. So if you have 3 months worth of charts, if you're working with someone over a period of time, then you can really see as they make changes how it can, whether the changes are making a positive or a negative effect on the cycle. So it's this real-time biomarker that is individualized, because of course it has to be, and it really tells you what is going to work for this person. And it kind of takes away some of the conversation around the idea that there's one thing that's going to work for everyone, or there's one way to do things that's going to work for everyone. Because when you start to see the cycle and how it fluctuates, you can have two clients that are doing very similar things, but their cycles respond in different ways. Like you can have someone who can really get away with a lot of exercise and things like that, and it doesn't really budge their cycle a whole lot, but you can have another client who adds in an extra, workout, and it really makes a difference. And so from that perspective, it can be really useful. But the second kind of major way that the cycle can be very, very useful from a practitioner perspective is that it invites your client into this incredible knowledge so your client can actually see for themselves as well. Because in the work that I do, obviously, we're looking at the charts together. So certainly I'm helping my clients interpret those charts, but my clients are obviously looking at them too. And so especially when you're able to work over a period of time, a couple of months, depending on how long your work together is, when your client sees with her own eyes that when she takes a day off of rest, or when she adds back in breakfast, when she switches to decaf and gets her morning appetite back and starts adding back breakfast, and she sees that perhaps her temperature normalizes a bit, or her luteal phase lengthens by day, or whatever the case is, when she sees that she is actually having the effect on her cycles, it makes your job a lot easier from the practitioner perspective, because it's not really about you and your knowledge and what you say. One of the things I always say to my clients is like, it doesn't really matter what I say. What matters is what happens in your cycle. And so if we're on the right track, we're going to see those positive changes in the right direction. And if we're not on the right track, we're going to see it. So I can have my hypothesis and I can share it with you. My hypothesis is that you need to eat breakfast. Again, my clients are laughing. And that's all well and good. But what the real science, and again, this is also one of the things I love about the cycle, because it's truly a scientific endeavor. Because really, like, we have the hypothesis, okay, I think that you need to eat breakfast. And then you eat breakfast for a cycle, and then we see what happens. And again, the cycle tells us the answer, basically. And so that can be extremely, extremely motivating. And it's something that can really help your clients to, because it becomes less about you and what you say, and more about the results. And so that in and of itself, it can be just so motivating and empowering, because obviously your client is now involved and they can now see the positive changes themselves. And it kind of changes everything, I feel like. And of course, I would say I'm not necessarily objective, because this is the way that I work. But I can't imagine doing work with women without the chart, because it really does serve as this. It's like a third party. It's like an honorary member of the relationship between client and practitioner, because the cycle responds to what you're doing. So to kind of go over that again, the one big thing, of course, is that it helps you to see for yourself. And I think also for practitioners, it can help if you have any dogmatic beliefs about diet or about exercise, or if you actually, I think all of us have certain dogmatic beliefs, but if you have certain beliefs like this is the way that it needs to be, or this is the protocol that everyone needs to do, like if you kind of have certain dogmatic beliefs yourself, then when you actually see the cycle and how you could have two people doing the same things and it doesn't work, and I'm sure for the practitioners listening, there are plenty of other scenarios in your work where you've seen things like that, where you do have certain protocols and you see how incredibly one person can respond to it, but how another person may not respond very well at all. So, but it's another way to see that bio-individuality and to really tell you if what you're doing is working, you're going to see a change. And if what you're doing is not working, you're not going to see a change. But also, if you've ever struggled to kind of motivate your clients to make some of those positive changes, as soon as you start to see that, this is what I found anyways, but as soon as women start to see that they have the power to make those changes and to see those positive improvements in their cycle with the different changes that they make, as soon as they become aware of that and the link between the cycle and their health and their actions and their activities, I think many of us it's such a kind of novel concept that we're not taught, that when you actually see with your eyes that your exercise and your diet and all these things actually make a tangible difference in what you're doing, it really can motivate you more so than lectures and data, like, because this is like real world stuff. So yeah, it's the menstrual cycle charting for the win. So just as a bit of a recap, so basically we were talking about decoding the male influencer space. I didn't mean to throw any male, like I said, I wasn't going to name any names or do anything like that, but I just wanted to talk about it kind of in a general way, because if any of you are tuning into this episode specifically because of this reason, then you already know. So I don't actually need to go and like name names and be all specific. But certainly this concept, this whole idea, these men that we follow that for fitness and diet, it certainly is filtering into the women's reproductive health space as well. And certainly there are effects that it can have. And of course, it's disappointing. I mean, if only it was so easy, right? You know, when you see this man having these great results from doing things in certain ways, and then you try to do those things and you don't necessarily get the same results. And so it's just important to know that, yeah, so intermittent fasting, I wouldn't say women can't do it, but I say that if you're a woman of reproductive age, you should do it differently. And your cycle should be the guide as to how to go about it. And my recommendation typically is the 3 meals a day option, where if you want to intermittent fast, 3 meals a day, skip the snacks, like we talked about earlier. So the one diet concept. So whenever you find yourself following someone who's basically saying everyone needs to eat like this is the diet. This is the ideal diet. This is the diet that's going to cure all disease. And whenever you get into that kind of space, again, I shared my thoughts on how there is no diet for everyone and there is no one diet for everyone at every point in their life. And certainly it's up for debate, but I'm just sharing my thoughts on that. And then also the magical supplement thing. So if you find yourself following people who are telling you like, everyone needs to take this supplement, everyone needs to take this thing, again, those kinds of comments, well-meaning as they are, can really lead us to do certain things just because it seems like a good idea. And it can lead us away from really just looking at the individuality of each person. We all do not need the exact same things. Many of us struggle with a variety of different health challenges. And so all I can say is a good model for health moving forward from my perspective would be one that's individualized. I often wonder why it's not just standard practice in medicine to test people for a variety of nutrient deficiencies so that we can figure out what specifically they need. What specifically do you need more of or less of? What kinds of things are going to really support your menstrual cycle health and your reproductive hormone health? Why would there be a one-size-fits-all approach for everyone? And of course, the kind of big anchor to our conversation today was the menstrual cycle as the great equalizer. And so ultimately, what it comes down to is your cycle gets the last say. If your cycle is not within normal range, then there's something going on that we need to look at. And it's just that simple. And if you've tried everything else, there comes a point where you need to look at some of these things, the diet and exercise and the fasting. So if you enjoyed today's episode, certainly tag me on social media. I will link all of the podcasts that are similar, previous podcasts that I've done on intermittent fasting, as I mentioned before. And a few of those podcasts have mentioned this kind of male influencer space idea. So you'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/352. And this is, if you're listening to this episode in real time, the Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program is actually starting in a week or so. We're starting the first week of March. If you're listening in real time, we will be starting the class of 2021 in a week. So make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/famlive. That's FAMMLIVE. I'm so excited to start this mentorship program. It's been in the works for a while. If you haven't checked out the page, I've updated the page with this year's guest teachers. So FAMM stands for the Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship. And FAM will teach practitioners standardized charting protocols, client assessment protocols, and essentially teach you how to use the menstrual cycle as a vital sign within your practice and as a standardized way of charting that will allow you to gather as much information as possible from the charts. And I think it can seem really simple. If you've charted your own cycles, it seems pretty simple and basic, but there is quite a bit of information that you can learn from the chart when you actually break it all down into all the different parts. And when you have your clients chart in a standardized way so that we can really all be talking the same language is usually how I describe it to my clients. So again, for more information and to jump in and register before we start, about a week or so, head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAMLive. That's FAMMLIVE. And with that, I want to thank you for tuning in to today's episode. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.